Before we get into the nebulous realms of compassion and morality and all those other human complications that seem far too large to contemplate, I'd actually just like to pause for a second on something more semantic, because my talk started out as a question, does moral fatigue dilute compassion? And the nature of questions implies that they're asked for one or a number of specific reasons to elicit an answer. And given that, I can't really say that I answered these huge questions about morality. So instead, you're going to have to bear with me while I call this a deconstruction. So that's the framework we're working under. It's really just me sorting through my own emotional conflict. And also, just a quick thing, when I say media, I'm largely referring to news coverage and broadcasting on both traditional and new mediums. So here we actually go. You see, morality, as defined, is the principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong. It's the differentiation of intentions, decisions, and actions. And moral dilemmas manifest themselves all around us. They wreak havoc, whether it's, stopping yourself from eating that last slice of pizza or avoiding that convenient coffee shop down the road that you know donates to causes that you just can't get behind. Or maybe it's confessing to something that's going to send your best friend off to prison for the next 10 years. The last one's actually famous. It's called the prisoner's dilemma, and they use it in game theory. The point is that all of these examples rely on this conflict between self-preservation and self-interest and goodwill for others. And so when I was thinking about these things, what struck me is that doing the right thing seems to have an inherent connotation of doing justice by other people. It's something to bear in mind. On the other hand, we have immorality, which is the active opposition to any moral principles, the bad people. I actually like to say the bad decisions, because I think that's an important distinction to make, and I'll leave that with you. But what I think is more interestingly, well, of course I do, is amorality, especially at this point in time. And amorality is the indifference to any moral principles. You see, it's like being thrown into a ring, is how I think of it, because we've been asked to deflect these punches from both the augmented nature of tragedy and the media at the same time. And this has edged us closer and closer towards simply not caring, to be indifferent, to be unaffected by the plight of others. And this is dangerous. Our collective morality is on this slippery slope towards this indifference. We've gone from questioning these infinite shades of gray to not even caring if black, white, or gray exist. And so this morality, I think, exists not for being moral, but for the sake of appearances, to appear moral. And I think it's actually quite redundant most of the time, because it's really just a reflection of my phone screen or my laptop or my mobile is my phone. And so it really doesn't exist in its own right. We are operating at its most basic threshold of what it takes to be moral. And that's because the weight of making a decision weighs heavy. It is literally exhausting. And it's forced us to reach a state of compassion fatigue. It's also the reason why I, as an 18-year-old, have literally taken a nap every single day for the past 2 years. But that's a different conversation. And it's because these images and these stories we see have a profound impact. We're emotional beings. It's easier to sit there and put on that Facebook filter to avoid that difficult conversation in the morning than it is to feel that blunt force of empathy. One of my personal icons, Susan Sontag, said this about one of her experiences with photography. And she said that some limit had been reached, not just that of horror. I felt irrevocably grieved, wounded. Something went dead. Something is still crying. And I think we've all been there. I know I have. And for that very reason, I feel like my own morality sometimes thunders within my head, but can't seem to break out of my own mind. You see, now more so than ever, we all here consume media vociferously, and it affects how we think and we act, and more crucially, don't. So I'm not asking any of you to go out into the streets and beat your chest. I'm just saying that you need to be cognizant about the fact that your apathy is dangerous. Right? Sorry. And that's just so important, because what's actually interesting is that when I sat down to write this and to actually delivering it today, I've seen a completely new side of this argument emerge. Cataclysmic political decisions have taken place in the last few months, and as I watch my world change rapidly and absolutely terrifyingly, I've also seen people mobilize like never before, because great hardship always gives birth to greater movements. I've seen the power of the press and the media as a collective, as the voice of morality, and it's emboldened people. It's because representation matters and it emboldens, and that is the media at its most quixotic. Sidestepping my little bit of optimism there for a second, the apathy has still done the damage. We've cultivated an empathy gap. And I completely understand this because distance provides escape from emotionally and mentally. It provides shelter from that absolutely assaulting truth. But what I've taken from that is that, and I think we all know this, is that there's no point in finding shelter under a house of cards. I think at some level we all do know this. For me, personally, it's rooted in the belief that the human condition is a shared one, and in our finer moments, that shared humanity echoes louder than anything else. And then, when I was reading up about this, my belief was confirmed in the Golden Rule, which is it's part of normative moral philosophy. It's a moral maxim that's that's prevalent in nearly every single human culture and religion, which to me suggests that it's a fundamental part of human nature. You see, it's an ethic concerned with reciprocity, to treat others as you would want to be treated yourself. And this demands that an active decision is made. One of my favorite existential philosophers, because I have many, Jean-Paul Sartre once said that when we say that man chooses for himself, we do mean that every man must choose for himself, but by that, we also mean that in choosing for himself, he chooses for all men, mankind, women. In essence, it operates on the foundations of compassion. There is an implied, unbreakable connection between the individual and the society, a connection through which each action takes on an additional responsibility. And when I looked into this that's the metaphorical level, and when I looked into this on the word level, the etymology of compassion in Latin is actually co-suffering. It's cognate to the Greek noun pathos, to evoke sympathy. And I think that that's so absolutely beautifully tragic, to suffer together, as if all of human understanding isn't based on what we have in common, but rather on our ability to sit down and ache with one another, for one another. There's no doubt that it's hard to feel moral all the time, because if we felt every ounce of pain in the world, we would implode, quite simply. Our emotions would be obliterated, and we would cease to remain compassionate. But because if I have to make a moral decision on one thing, do I really need to make a moral decision on everything? Whilst the hopeful in me yearns for this capacity, I am a cynical idealist at best. And even I know that I cannot encapsulate the pain of the world, but I can choose to not be blind to it. The reason I decided that I needed to talk about this today is because I read something that really, it hit home and it kind of buried itself inside. And it was this quote by Andrew Boyd, who so Andrew Boyd said, "Compassion hurts. When you feel connected to everything, you feel responsible for everything, and you cannot turn away. Your destiny is bound with the destiny of others. You must either learn to carry the universe or be crushed by it. You must be able to love the world and sit down at the table with its worst horrors. I do not know how to solve our growing aversion to compassion. I cannot answer those huge questions about morality, but I know that we have to be compassionate. None of us here can escape the tragedy of the world. That's just how it is. But you can choose to change the way you process what you consume. I'm a sucker for metaphor, but I think this analogy actually sums it up better. Compassion fatigue has had me hinged on the balance between wanting to be like a completely exposed nerve and not having any nerve endings at all, to be numb. And while compassion breeds pain, I would always like to pick the former. And I'd hope that you'd commit to that also. Essentially, this talk has stemmed from a desire to talk about something that has felt so overwhelming for so very long. To acknowledge that the struggle for morality is a struggle in the face of adversity with its teeth, to allow myself to sit down and be scared of sitting down with the world's horrors, to remind myself that I can and will become strong enough one day, because we cannot live and be submerged by waves of apathy. Instead, we must learn to live against the current, constantly seeking out compassion. Thank you very much.